the 3rd century after Christ. The Roman Empire, once the mightiest force on earth, is bleeding from 1,000 wounds. Barbarian tribes hammer at the borders like vultures circling a dying beast. Civil wars tear the heart of the empire apart as general after general declares himself emperor, only to fall within months to the next ambitious commander. The economy is in shambles, cities are abandoned, and the very idea of Rome is crumbling into dust. In this chaos, in this moment when it seemed like the greatest civilization the world had ever known was about to breathe its last breath, an unlikely hero emerged from the shadows. He wasn't born into the purple like a Caesar. He didn't carry the divine blood of Augustus in his veins. He was just a soldier's son from a forgotten corner of the empire, a boy from Dalmatia whose father had once been a slave. But this humble soldier would become something extraordinary. His name was Diocletian, and he would do what no emperor before him had dared to attempt. He would take the crumbling giant that was Rome and rebuild it from the ground up, creating a system so revolutionary that it would keep the empire alive for another 1,000 years in the East. Here's what makes Diocletian's story absolutely fascinating. He didn't just save Rome through conquest or military might. He saved it by doing something that would have been unthinkable to any Roman before him. He shared power. He divided the empire. And then, in a move that shocked the ancient world to its core, he did something no Roman emperor had ever done voluntarily. He walked away. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about absolute power over the known world, wealth beyond imagination, the ability to shape the destiny of millions with a single word. And Diocletian gave it all up to grow vegetables in his retirement palace by the Adriatic Sea. When desperate senators begged him to return and save the empire once again, he supposedly told them, "If you could see the cabbages I grow with my own hands, you wouldn't ask me to give up this happiness for the storms of political life." But here's the question that should haunt every leader, every person in power, every one of us who's ever held responsibility over others. What would you do if you were standing in Diocletian's sandals? Imagine you're facing the greatest crisis in your civilization's history. The old ways aren't working. Everything is falling apart. Would you have the wisdom to completely reinvent the system, even if it meant sharing your power with others? Would you have the strength to make the hard, unpopular decisions that might save everyone but make you hated? And perhaps most importantly, would you have the courage to step away when your work was done, knowing that your carefully built system might crumble without you? These aren't just questions about ancient Rome. They're questions about leadership, about sacrifice, about knowing when to hold on and when to let go. They're questions that echo through every boardroom, every political office, every moment when someone has to choose between personal ambition and the greater good. If you want to discover how this remarkable man transformed the mightiest empire in history, how his revolutionary ideas shaped the world we live in today, and why his story of power, sacrifice, and ultimate wisdom still matters 1,500 years later, then you're in for an incredible journey. Hit that like button if you're ready to dive deep into one of history's most fascinating characters. Share this video with anyone who loves epic stories of triumph against impossible odds. And make sure to subscribe to Imperium Chronicles for more incredible tales from the ancient world that will change how you see power, leadership, and the price of greatness. Trust me, Diocletian's story will make you question everything you thought you knew about what it means to be truly powerful. Picture this. It's the year 284 after Christ, and the Roman Empire is literally falling apart at the seams. For over 50 years, Rome has been drowning in what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. But let me paint you the real picture of just how bad things had gotten. Imagine an empire where emperors lasted about as long as your favorite Netflix series gets renewed. In 50 years, Rome had cycled through more than 20 emperors. Some ruled for months, others for mere weeks. Most met violent ends, assassinated by their own soldiers, killed in battle, or murdered by political rivals. The imperial purple had become less of an honor and more of a death sentence. But the chaos wasn't just at the top. Barbarian tribes were hammering at every frontier. The Goths were ravaging the Balkans. Germanic tribes were crossing the Rhine like it was a neighborhood street, and Persian armies were conquering Roman territories in the east. Meanwhile, inside the empire, entire regions were breaking away. Gaul had declared independence under its own Gallic Empire, and in the east, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra was carving out her own kingdom from Roman lands. The economy was in complete freefall. Roman coins, once the gold standard of the ancient world, were now so debased with cheap metals that merchants weighed them rather than counted them. Inflation was running wild, trade routes were collapsing, and cities that had thrived for centuries were being abandoned. In the middle of this absolute nightmare, there was a career soldier named Diocletian. But here's the thing that makes his story so incredible. This man who would save the empire wasn't born into privilege or power. His father was a freedman, essentially a former slave who had earned his liberty. In Roman society, this was about as low as you could start and still have a chance at advancement. Diocletian was born in Dalmatia, in what we now call Croatia, probably around the year 244. His birth name was likely Diocles. Diocletian was the grand imperial name he'd adopt later. Growing up, he would have spoken Latin with a provincial accent, the kind that made sophisticated Romans from the capital sneer. But the army was different. The Roman military was one of the few places where talent could triumph over birth. If you were brave, if you were smart, if you could lead men in battle and keep them alive, you could rise. And Diocletian had all of these qualities in spades. He started as a common soldier, carrying a spear and marching in formation with thousands of others. But he caught the attention of his superiors. Maybe it was his tactical mind, maybe his natural leadership, or perhaps his ability to stay calm when everyone else was panicking. Whatever it was, he began climbing the ranks. By the 270s, Diocletian had become a senior officer, trusted enough to serve in the imperial bodyguard. Think about that for a moment. A former slave's son was now protecting the emperor himself. But here's where the story gets really dramatic. In 283, Emperor Carus launched a campaign against the Persians. Diocletian was there, serving as a commander. The campaign started well. They captured the Persian capital and were pushing deep into enemy territory. But then disaster struck. Carus died suddenly, probably from illness, though some whispered about lightning strikes or poison. His son Numerianus became emperor. But the young man was inexperienced and possibly ill himself. The army began its long retreat back to Roman territory, and somewhere along the way, something terrible happened. Numerianus was found dead in his tent. Now, here's where different versions of the story emerge, and they read like something out of a political thriller. The official version says Numerianus died of an eye infection that had been bothering him, but there were darker rumors. Some said he'd been murdered by his own father-in-law, a man named Aper, who was the Praetorian prefect, essentially the head of the imperial bodyguard. The army was in chaos. They were hundreds of miles from home, in hostile territory, with their emperor dead and no clear successor. This was exactly the kind of moment that had been tearing the empire apart for decades. Soldiers would start fighting each other, rival claimants would emerge, and before you knew it, you'd have another civil war. But then something extraordinary happened. The soldiers didn't turn on each other. Instead, they turned to Diocletian. Here was a man they trusted, a proven commander who had earned his position through merit rather than birth or politics. In a dramatic ceremony, they proclaimed him emperor. But Diocletian wasn't content to just accept the purple and hope for the best. In a move that showed his political genius, he immediately addressed the elephant in the room, the suspicious death of Numerianus. Standing before the assembled army, he dramatically drew his sword and struck down Aper, declaring that he was avenging the murdered emperor. Whether Aper was actually guilty, or whether this was a calculated political move, we'll never know. But the effect was electric. In one stroke, Diocletian had shown that he would punish those who betrayed the empire, and he'd eliminated a potential rival who might have contested his claim to power. But even as the soldiers cheered their new emperor, Diocletian faced an almost impossible challenge. How could an outsider, a provincial soldier with no aristocratic connections, no inherited wealth, no network of senatorial allies, possibly hope to reunify an empire that was literally coming apart at the seams? The traditional Roman elite looked down on him. The various usurpers controlling different parts of the empire had no reason to submit to his authority. And everywhere he looked, there were enemies. Barbarians on the frontiers, rebels in the provinces, and ambitious generals who might decide they deserved the purple more than he did. Most new emperors in this era tried to solve these problems the traditional way, through military force and political alliances. They'd march their armies against one enemy after another, hoping to intimidate or defeat their way to stability. But Diocletian was about to prove that he was anything but a traditional emperor. What he did next would revolutionize not just the Roman Empire, but the very concept of imperial power itself. And it all started with a simple recognition that the old ways of ruling were broken and only radical innovation could save Rome from complete collapse. The provincial soldier's son was about to become one of history's greatest political innovators. But first, he had to survive long enough to put his revolutionary ideas into practice. Now, here's where Diocletian proved he wasn't just another ambitious general who happened to grab power. What he did next was so revolutionary, so completely against everything Romans believed about imperial rule, that it literally saved the empire from total collapse. Think about it. For 300 years, Rome had been ruled by a single emperor. Augustus had established this system, and it had worked brilliantly for generations. One man, one purple cloak, one supreme authority over the known world. It was simple, it was traditional, and by Diocletian's time, it was completely broken. The problem was obvious once you really looked at it. The Roman Empire had grown too massive for one person to control effectively. Picture trying to manage a corporation with offices on every continent, except your fastest communication travels at the speed of a galloping horse, and half your regional managers are actively plotting to take your job. When barbarians attacked the Rhine frontier, it could take months for word to reach the emperor, and even longer for him to march an army there to respond. Meanwhile, while he was dealing with Germans in the north, Persians might invade in the east, rebels could rise in Egypt, and ambitious governors might declare independence in Britain. It was like playing a deadly game of whack-a-mole, except every mole you missed could destroy a province. But here's what made Diocletian a genius. Instead of trying to do everything himself, he did something that would have horrified every previous emperor. He decided to share power. And I don't mean he appointed some advisors or delegated minor responsibilities. I mean he literally divided the empire and gave away half of it. In 285, just 1 year after becoming emperor, Diocletian promoted his old military comrade Maximian to the rank of Caesar, essentially making him junior emperor. Then in the following year, he took the unprecedented step of elevating Maximian to Augustus, co-emperor with equal authority. Can you imagine the shock? Romans had just witnessed their new emperor voluntarily cut his own power in half. The Senate, the army, the people, everyone was stunned. Some probably thought he'd lost his mind. After all, sharing power meant sharing glory, sharing wealth, and most dangerously, creating a potential rival. But Diocletian had thought this through carefully. He kept the eastern half of the empire for himself, the richer, more urbanized region that included the vital grain supplies from Egypt and the lucrative trade routes to Asia. Maximian got the western half, including Italy, Gaul, Spain, and Britain. Each emperor would be responsible for defending and governing his own territory, but they would coordinate their efforts and present a united front to the world. The arrangement worked brilliantly. While Diocletian was campaigning against Persian invasions in the east, Maximian was crushing barbarian incursions in Gaul and putting down rebellions in Britain. For the first time in decades, Rome could respond quickly to multiple threats simultaneously. But Diocletian wasn't finished. In 293, he took his revolutionary idea even further and created what historians call the Tetrarchy. rule by 4. He and Maximian each appointed a junior emperor, a Caesar who would serve as their heir and deputy. Diocletian chose Galerius, a tough soldier from the Balkans who had proven himself in the Persian Wars. Maximian selected Constantius, nicknamed Chlorus, or the Pale, who had distinguished himself fighting in Gaul and Britain. Now there were 4 rulers, 2 senior Augusti and 2 junior Caesars, each responsible for a quarter of the empire. The system was elegant in its simplicity. The Caesars would handle regional crises while learning the art of imperial rule. After 20 years, the Augusti would retire. The Caesars would be promoted to senior emperor, and they would each appoint their own junior partners. It promised stability, continuity, and an end to the succession crises that had plagued Rome for generations. But Diocletian knew that practical arrangements weren't enough. Romans were deeply traditional people who believed in the divine nature of imperial authority. How do you convince people to accept not 1, but 4 emperors? How do you prevent people from seeing this as a sign of weakness rather than strength? This is where Diocletian showed his political genius. He didn't just create a new governmental system, he created an entirely new imperial mythology. He declared that he and his fellow rulers weren't just ordinary men who happened to hold power. They were the earthly representatives of the gods themselves. Diocletian took the title Jovius, marking himself as the representative of Jupiter, the king of the gods. This wasn't just a fancy nickname. In Roman religion, Jupiter was the supreme deity, the god of sky and thunder, the divine ruler whose authority was absolute and unquestionable. By claiming this connection, Diocletian was saying that his power came not from the Senate, not from the army, but directly from heaven itself. Maximian became Herculeus, the representative of Hercules. Now, this was brilliant psychology. Hercules wasn't just any hero, he was the divine strongman, the one who performed impossible labors, the protector who used his strength to save civilization from monsters and chaos. What better patron for an emperor whose job was to fight barbarians and restore order? The 2 junior emperors, the Caesars, were presented as sons or adopted heirs of these divine figures. Galerius was the son of Jovius Diocletian, while Constantius was the son of Herculeus Maximian. It created a divine family tree that legitimized the entire system. Think about how clever this was. Romans were used to worshiping the emperor as a god. But now they had 4 divine rulers, each with a specific role and divine patron. It wasn't division of power. It was divine specialization. Jupiter and Hercules weren't competing with each other in mythology. They were working together to protect the world. So why shouldn't their earthly representatives do the same? The religious imagery extended to everything. Imperial ceremonies became elaborate affairs where the tetrarchs appeared in matching purple robes, surrounded by identical ceremonial guards, speaking in unison as if they were one divine entity speaking through 4 mouths. Coins showed all 4 rulers together, emphasizing their unity. Art depicted them as nearly identical figures, sometimes literally carved from the same block of stone. But here's what's really fascinating. This wasn't just propaganda. It actually worked. For the first time in decades, the empire had stable leadership that could respond effectively to multiple crises. While one emperor was fighting Persians, another was securing the Rhine, a third was dealing with rebels in Egypt, and the fourth was managing the economy and administration. The results spoke for themselves. Rebellious provinces were brought back under control. Barbarian invasions were repelled. The Persian threat was neutralized. The economy began to recover. After 50 years of chaos, Rome was finally stable again. But perhaps most remarkably, the Tetrarchs genuinely seemed to trust each other. There were no civil wars between them, no attempts at betrayal or power grabs. Each ruler stayed in his assigned territory and focused on his responsibilities. It was as if Diocletian had somehow solved the fundamental problem of power, how to share it without destroying it. Of course, there were challenges. Some traditionalists grumbled about the new system. The increased bureaucracy was expensive. The multiple courts and armies strained the budget, and there was always the question of what would happen when it came time for the first planned succession. But for now, the Tetrarchy was working. Rome had been saved from collapse, and the credit belonged to a provincial soldier who had dared to completely reimagine how an empire should be ruled. Diocletian had proven that sometimes the most radical solutions are the only ones that work. Little did anyone know that this system, born from desperate necessity, would reshape not just Rome, but the entire future of European governance. The idea that power could be divided, shared, and transferred peacefully would echo through the centuries, influencing everything from medieval kingdoms to modern federal governments. But that's getting ahead of our story. For now, the Tetrarchy was working, and Rome was finally breathing freely again after decades of suffocation. The question was, could this revolutionary system survive its first real test? Now, having 4 emperors instead of 1 solved the problem of military response and regional control, but Diocletian quickly realized that political restructuring was just the beginning. The empire's problems ran much deeper than leadership. They were systemic, built into the very foundations of how Rome operated, and fixing them would require reforms so radical that they would fundamentally change what it meant to be Roman. Let's start with the most obvious issue: administration. For centuries, Roman provinces had been massive territories governed by a single proconsul or propraetor. These governors had enormous power. They controlled armies, collected taxes, dispensed justice, and managed trade. It was a system that worked when governors were loyal and competent, but it was a disaster when they weren't. Think about it. An ambitious governor in charge of a huge, wealthy province like Gaul or Syria had all the resources he needed to fund a rebellion. He had soldiers under his command, tax revenue to pay them, and enough territory to build a power base. No wonder the 3rd century had been filled with usurpers and breakaway kingdoms. Diocletian's solution was brilliantly simple: divide and conquer. He took the existing provinces and split them up, sometimes into thirds or quarters. Where there had been roughly 50 provinces, now there were nearly 100. A governor who might have controlled territory the size of modern France now found himself managing an area about the size of Belgium. But here's the genius part. He didn't just make the provinces smaller, he completely separated military and civilian authority. The new provincial governors, called praesides, controlled only civil administration, taxes, courts, public works, and local government. Military command went to separate officers called duces, who reported directly to the imperial court, not to the local governor. This meant that even if a governor decided to rebel, he had no army to do it with. And even if a military commander got ambitious ideas, he had no civilian administration to fund his rebellion. It was like separating the keys to the treasury from the keys to the armory. To manage this vastly expanded bureaucracy, Diocletian created an entirely new level of administration. He grouped the smaller provinces into 12 dioceses, each overseen by a vicarius who reported directly to the praetorian prefects. It sounds complicated, and it was, but it was also effective. For the first time in decades, the imperial government could actually control what was happening in distant provinces. Of course, all these new administrators had to be paid, and that brings us to Diocletian's economic reforms, which were both brilliant and catastrophic, depending on your perspective. The empire's currency had been in freefall for decades. Emperors had been debasing coins so severely that by Diocletian's time, silver coins contained barely any silver at all. Merchants were refusing to accept imperial currency. Trade was reverting to barter, and the entire monetary system was on the verge of collapse. Diocletian's first move was to introduce a new gold coin called the solidus, which became the backbone of Roman currency for the next 7 centuries. This wasn't just a new denomination. It was a statement of intent. The solidus contained a fixed amount of pure gold, and Diocletian made it clear that this standard would not be compromised. But even more dramatically, in 301, he issued what became known as the Edict on Maximum Prices. This was essentially the ancient world's most comprehensive attempt at price controls. The edict listed over 1,000 different goods and services, from wheat and wine to haircuts and legal fees, and set maximum prices for all of them. The penalties for violating these price controls were severe. Death for both buyers and sellers who exceeded the maximum prices. Diocletian wasn't messing around. He genuinely believed that merchants and speculators were destroying the economy through greed, and he was determined to stop them. Now, any modern economist will tell you that price controls don't work. They create shortages, black markets, and economic distortion. And that's exactly what happened. Merchants simply stopped selling goods at the artificially low prices, creating shortages that made inflation even worse. The edict was eventually abandoned, but not before causing enormous economic disruption. But here's the thing that's often overlooked. Diocletian's price controls actually made sense within the context of Roman economic thinking. Romans didn't think of markets as self-regulating systems. They thought of commerce as a moral activity that should serve the common good. From their perspective, merchants who raised prices during shortages weren't responding to market forces. They were being greedy and unpatriotic. The military reforms were perhaps the most successful and long-lasting of Diocletian's changes. The traditional Roman army had been built around legions stationed in permanent bases along the frontiers. This worked fine when threats were predictable and localized, but it was useless against the kind of simultaneous multi-front attacks that had plagued the 3rd century. Diocletian revolutionized this system by creating 2 distinct types of military units. The limitanae were frontier troops, stationed in heavily fortified positions along the borders. These were essentially defensive specialists, trained to hold fortified positions and slow down invading armies. But the real innovation was the creation of the comitatenses, mobile field armies that could be rapidly deployed wherever they were needed most. These troops were the elite of the Roman military, better trained, better equipped, and better paid than the limitanae. They didn't have permanent bases along the frontiers. Instead, they were stationed in strategic locations within the empire, ready to march quickly to any threatened area. Imagine the difference this made. Before, if Persians invaded Syria, the local frontier troops had to hold out until reinforcements could march from Italy or Gaul, a process that could take months. Now, a mobile field army stationed in Anatolia could respond to a Persian invasion in weeks. Meanwhile, if barbarians crossed the Rhine, the Syrian crisis didn't strip defenders from the German frontier because the mobile armies were separate from the frontier garrisons. Diocletian also invested heavily in frontier fortifications. The old system of scattered forts was replaced by a comprehensive network of watchtowers, signal fires, and fortified positions that could coordinate their defense. Archaeological evidence shows that Diocletian built or rebuilt hundreds of military installations across the empire. But all of these reforms came with a price, and not just in terms of money, though the financial cost was staggering. The expanded bureaucracy, the larger army, the new fortifications, and the multiple imperial courts all had to be funded somehow. Taxes increased dramatically, and new forms of taxation were introduced. The most hated was probably the annona militaris, a tax paid in kind rather than money. Farmers had to provide grain, meat, and other supplies directly to the army. Craftsmen had to supply manufactured goods. It was efficient for the government, but it was deeply unpopular with the people who had to pay it. Even more controversial was the way Diocletian restructured Roman society itself. He created a rigid caste system where people were legally bound to their occupations. If your father was a baker, you had to be a baker. If you were born a farmer, you couldn't leave your land to seek opportunities in the city. Sons of soldiers had to become soldiers. It was social control on a scale that Rome had never seen before. The reasoning was practical. The government needed to ensure a steady supply of essential services. They couldn't risk having all the bakers decide to become merchants, or all the farmers move to the cities. But the human cost was enormous. For the first time in centuries, Romans found their life choices dictated by imperial decree. Traditional Roman aristocrats were horrified by many of these changes. The Senate, which had been the center of Roman political life for centuries, found itself increasingly irrelevant. The old Roman virtues of individual initiative and civic responsibility were being replaced by bureaucratic efficiency and imperial control. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The reforms worked. The empire stabilized, the frontiers held. The economy, despite the problems with price controls, began to recover. Cities that had been abandoned during the crisis were reoccupied. Trade routes reopened. The death spiral of the 3rd century was reversed. Diocletian had essentially made a deal with the Roman people. Give up some of your freedoms, accept higher taxes and more government control, and in return, you'll have security, stability, and prosperity. For most people, especially after the chaos of the previous 50 years, it was a deal worth making. But it came at a cost that went beyond money or personal freedom. Diocletian's reforms fundamentally changed what Rome was. The relatively decentralized, somewhat flexible empire of Augustus and Trajan was gone forever, replaced by a highly centralized, rigidly controlled state that looked more like what we might recognize as a medieval kingdom. The question that would haunt Roman politics for the next century was whether this transformation was temporary, a necessary response to crisis, or permanent. Had Diocletian saved the Roman Empire, or had he replaced it with something entirely different? And speaking of transformations, here's something that will blow your mind. Diocletian was the only Roman emperor in history to voluntarily give up power. That's right. This man, who had accumulated more authority than any ruler since Augustus, would eventually walk away from it all. But why would someone abandon ultimate power at the height of his success? Picture this scene. It's May 1st, 305 after Christ, and the most powerful man in the world is about to do something that no Roman emperor had ever done before, something so unprecedented that it would leave the entire Roman world in complete shock. Diocletian, now in his 60s and having ruled for over 20 years, gathered his fellow tetrarchs and announced that he was stepping down. Not because he was dying, not because he'd been overthrown, not because of any crisis or scandal. He was abdicating simply because he believed it was time. The announcement sent shockwaves through the empire. Romans had grown accustomed to emperors who clung to power until their dying breath, who were assassinated by rivals, or who died in battle defending their throne. The idea of an emperor voluntarily walking away from absolute power was literally incomprehensible to most people. But Diocletian had thought this through carefully. Remember, the Tetrarchy was supposed to be a system of planned succession. The 2 senior Augusti were meant to retire after 20 years, allowing the junior Caesares to be promoted and appoint their own successors. It was designed to prevent the succession crises that had plagued Rome for decades. True to his word, Diocletian pressured his co-emperor Maximian to abdicate alongside him. Maximian was reportedly much less enthusiastic about retirement. He loved power and had no desire to give it up. But Diocletian was insistent. The system only worked if both senior emperors stepped down together. On the same day in May 305, both Augusti formally abdicated. Galerius and Constantius, the former Caesars, were promoted to senior emperor, and they each appointed new junior partners. For the first time in Roman history, imperial power had been transferred peacefully according to a predetermined plan. But here's where the story gets really fascinating. What did the most powerful man in the world do after giving up absolute authority? He went home to Croatia. Diocletian retired to a magnificent palace he had been building in his hometown of Split in modern-day Croatia. And when I say palace, I mean something that was more like a small fortified city. The palace complex covered almost 10 acres, with walls 60 feet high and towers that rose even higher. It had its own temples, baths, residential quarters, and even a mausoleum where Diocletian planned to be buried. But the most remarkable thing about Diocletian's retirement wasn't the grandeur of his palace. It was how completely he embraced private life. This man, who had commanded armies, reformed an empire, and wielded power over millions of people, became, essentially, a gentleman farmer. According to ancient sources, Diocletian spent his time gardening. He grew vegetables, especially cabbages, which became almost legendary. He tended his plants with the same careful attention he had once devoted to governing provinces. Visitors to his palace were amazed to see the former emperor of Rome walking through his gardens, checking on his crops like any ordinary farmer. Now, you might think this sounds peaceful and idyllic, but there's a darker undertone to Diocletian's retirement. Almost immediately after he stepped down, his carefully constructed system began to fall apart. The problem was that while Diocletian had planned for orderly succession, he hadn't planned for what would happen to the Tetrarch's sons. Constantine, the son of Constantius, felt he deserved to be appointed Caesar. Maxentius, the son of Maximian, had similar ambitions. When they were passed over in favor of other candidates, they decided to take power by force. Within just a few years of Diocletian's abdication, the empire was plunged back into civil war. Constantine seized control of Britain and Gaul. Maxentius took over Italy and declared himself emperor. Old Maximian came out of retirement and tried to reclaim power. The Tetrarchy, which had brought 20 years of stability, collapsed completely. As the empire burned with civil war once again, desperate messengers made their way to Split, begging the old emperor to return and restore order. After all, he was the only man with the prestige and experience to reunify the Tetrarchs and end the chaos. But Diocletian's response has become one of the most famous quotes in Roman history. When asked to leave his retirement and resume power, he supposedly replied, "If you could see at Split the cabbages I raise with my own hand, you would not urge me to give up the happiness of this place for the storms of never-satisfied ambition." Think about that for a moment. Here was a man who had literally saved the Roman Empire from collapse, who had wielded absolute power over the known world, and he was saying that growing vegetables made him happier than ruling an empire. There's something both admirable and heartbreaking about that response. Admirable because it shows a man who truly understood that there were more important things in life than power and glory. Heartbreaking because it reveals how exhausting and burdensome imperial rule had become. But there's also a deeper irony here. Diocletian had spent his entire reign trying to create a system that would prevent the kind of chaos that had plagued the 3rd century. He had divided power, created planned succession, established rigid bureaucratic controls, and transformed the very nature of imperial government. And yet, within 5 years of his retirement, everything was falling apart again. The civil wars that followed Diocletian's abdication were just as brutal and destructive as the ones he had worked so hard to prevent. Brothers fought brothers, fathers fought sons, and the empire was once again divided among competing claimants. It wouldn't be until Constantine's final victory at the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 that unity would be restored, and by then, the Tetrarchy was dead and buried. Diocletian lived to see all of this. He spent his final years in his palace at Split, watching from afar as his life's work crumbled. He never returned to public life, never tried to intervene in the civil wars, never attempted a comeback. He had made his choice, and he stuck to it. He died in 311, still in retirement, still tending his gardens. Some sources suggest he may have taken his own life, unable to bear watching the destruction of everything he had built. Others say he died peacefully in his sleep, finally at rest after a lifetime of struggle. But here's the most fascinating part of Diocletian's story. Even though his immediate system failed, his broader reforms survived and shaped the Roman Empire for centuries to come. The bureaucratic structures he created, the military innovations he introduced, and the administrative divisions he established became permanent features of Roman government. Future emperors might abandon the Tetrarchy, but they kept Diocletian's provincial system, his military reforms, and his expanded bureaucracy. Constantine, who eventually reunified the empire, built his new capital of Constantinople using Diocletian's model of imperial ceremony and divine legitimacy. In a very real sense, the Roman Empire that emerged from the civil wars after Diocletian's death was his empire, an autocratic, highly centralized state that bore little resemblance to the Rome of Augustus or Trajan. He had succeeded in his fundamental goal of transforming the empire to meet the challenges of a new age, even if his specific political arrangements didn't survive. And there's something profoundly moving about the image of this great emperor in his final years, not plotting comebacks or scheming for power, but quietly tending his cabbages in the palace gardens. It's a reminder that even the most ambitious and successful people ultimately find their greatest satisfaction not in conquest or dominion, but in simple, honest work, and the peace that comes from knowing when to walk away. Diocletian had saved Rome, transformed an empire, and created a new model of government that would influence European politics for over 1,000 years. But perhaps his greatest achievement was knowing when his work was done and having the courage to step away from power when lesser men would have clung to it until death. In the end, that may be the most revolutionary thing he ever did. So here we are, at the end of Diocletian's incredible journey. And what a journey it's been! From a humble soldier's son in the remote provinces of Dalmatia to the man who literally reshaped the Roman Empire. But as we close this chapter of history, I want you to think about something truly remarkable. Diocletian didn't just save Rome. He showed the world something that even today's leaders struggle to understand, that true power lies not in holding on to control, but in knowing when to let it go. Think about it. Here was a man who commanded legions, who ruled over millions, who could have anything he desired with a simple word. And yet, in 305 after Christ, he did something that shocked the ancient world. He walked away. Picture this scene for a moment. The most powerful man on earth, standing in his palace, removing the purple cloak of imperial authority for the last time. His advisors probably thought he'd lost his mind. Roman emperors didn't retire. They died in office, often violently. But Diocletian? He packed his bags and went home to Split, in what we now call Croatia, to tend his gardens. And here's where the story gets beautifully human. Years later, when Rome was once again descending into chaos and his former colleagues begged him to return, to save the empire one more time, do you know what he told them? He said, "If you could see the cabbages I've grown with my own hands, you wouldn't ask me to give up this peaceful life for the storms of imperial power." Can you imagine? The man who created the Tetrarchy, who reorganized the entire Roman military, who built some of the most impressive palaces of the ancient world, was genuinely more proud of his vegetables than his victories. There's something profoundly wise in that response, something that speaks to understanding what truly matters in life. But here's the thing about Diocletian's legacy. It didn't end with his retirement. His reforms, though they couldn't prevent the eventual division of the empire, laid the groundwork for what would become the Byzantine Empire. That eastern half of Rome that he helped create? It would survive for another 1,000 years, keeping the flame of Roman civilization burning long after the Western Empire fell. Even more fascinating is how his administrative innovations echo through history right up to our modern world. When we look at federal systems of government, at the idea of dividing power to make it more effective, at the concept of professional civil service, we're seeing the fingerprints of Diocletian's genius. His understanding that an empire too large for one person to govern effectively needed to be restructured rather than simply expanded. That's a lesson that resonates in boardrooms and capitals around the world today. And that brings us to a question that might make you uncomfortable. Does our modern world need a Diocletian? Think about it. We live in an age of global challenges that seem too big for any one leader, any one nation to handle alone. Climate change, economic inequality, technological disruption, the rise and fall of superpowers. Are we facing our own third-century crisis? And if so, do we need someone with the vision and, yes, the courage to restructure our systems rather than just trying to patch them up? The scary part is that Diocletian's solutions often came at a terrible cost. His persecution of Christians was brutal and systematic. His economic controls, while well-intentioned, often made life harder for ordinary people. His military reforms, though effective, turned the empire into something more like a military state. Progress, even necessary progress, rarely comes without a price. But perhaps that's the most important lesson Diocletian teaches us. Leadership, real leadership, isn't about being loved or even being right all the time. It's about making the hard choices that need to be made, even when they're unpopular, even when they're painful. And then, when the immediate crisis has passed, having the wisdom to step aside and let others build on what you've started. Diocletian saved Rome, but his greatest gift to history might be showing us that even the most powerful among us are just temporary stewards of something larger than themselves. In a world obsessed with celebrity and permanent power, there's something refreshing, almost revolutionary, about a leader who knew when his time was up. So what do you think? Was Diocletian Rome's greatest emperor, or just a skilled crisis manager who happened to be in the right place at the right time? Could his model of shared power and systematic reform work in today's world? And here's the big question. If you had the chance to wield absolute power, would you have the strength to give it up like he did? If this epic journey through Roman history has captured your imagination, if you found yourself thinking about the parallels between ancient Rome and our modern world, then I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button to let me know this story resonated with you. Share this video with your friends who love history, or better yet, with those who think history is boring, and show them just how wrong they are. And most importantly, subscribe to Imperium Chronicles and ring that notification bell, because we're just getting started on our journey through the rise and fall of empires. From Caesar's ambitions to Constantine's conversion, from the heights of Roman glory to the lessons we can learn from its eventual decline, there are so many more stories waiting to be told. The empire may have fallen, but its lessons live on. And in a world that sometimes feels like it's teetering on the edge of its own crisis, maybe, just maybe, those ancient voices have something important to tell us. Until next time, this is Imperium Chronicles, and remember, history doesn't just inform us about the past, it prepares us for the future.